For the next half hour or so, we're going to be chatting with the author of a book, Diary of a Teenage Empath, The Awakening. And, one of the news releases says, imagine walking into a room and feeling a rush of sadness, even though you don't see or hear the person who's crying, or getting a headache because the person sitting next to you has a headache. Meet the empath, a.k.a. the human sponge. Is Jeannette Folan, are you a human sponge?
I am indeed a human sponge, soaking up everything all the time.
What does that mean? What does that mean, empath?
An empath is somebody who absorbs more of the energy and the sensory information around them and then processes it at a deeper cognitive level. So essentially we feel and take on more than the 80% of the other people around us.
You know, when I first heard about this, I was wondering what it was that you were trying to enlighten us by, what it is that you're trying to do with this book. What is it? What's the goal?
The goal is to introduce young people to some of the social anxieties that they might be facing and why they might be facing them. If, as Dr. Elaine Aaron reports, that 20% of the population are highly sensitive people, then gosh, the population of Halifax West High School is 1,500 kids. That means 300 of them would be HSPs, highly sensitive. So I was trying to provide a tool in a fun, dramatic way, by way of a fiction book, introduce them to what it means to be highly sensitive and offer some tools that they can use to cope every day.
And I do want to talk about that, but I guess the question is, how does it manifest itself? How is it that someone would know that they're more sensitive or perhaps even empathetic to others? How does it, how are you going to know that?
Usually it starts in childhood, so it's not that you just wake up one day and realize that you're highly sensitive. You tend to cry easily. You have a hard time watching anything violent or even scary horror movies tend to really disturb you. You also find yourself taking on the feelings of other people around you. So if they're happy, you're suddenly happy. If they're sad, you're suddenly sad.
Wonder what the opposite of this is. Maybe it's sometimes a talk show host. Not me. But that whole idea, the story I tell when my son was in primary, you had that first parent-teacher interview, and the teacher said, your son's really, really worried about what the other kids, whether they're done their work, and so he has empathy. This is a problem? I don't understand. How is this a bad thing? How can this be a bad thing for people?
Because if you don't understand what it is that you're feeling, why you're feeling what you're feeling, it makes you anxious. Why do I feel sad? I'm looking around me and I'm saying I have a beautiful family, I have a beautiful dog, I have friends, my kids, my friends, my social life is okay. Why do I feel sad all the time? Perhaps you are around other people who are sad or anxious, and even if they're not directly expressing that to you, you can still be picking up on that energy. So many times the kids walk around and they are feeling anxious. You can see it in their faces. Of course, as your last guest mentioned, that there's so much mental health issues right now. And I know my niece, for example, in Chicago, she's being treated for social anxieties, and she identifies with the characters in this book extremely.
It's called The Awakening. We're talking with the author, Jeannette Folan. That's the correct way to pronounce your last name. This story, how long in the making? How long did it take you to put this down? Because it is a work of fiction, as you say. Right? It
is, in fact, a work of fiction. I started it as a diary for myself because I was undergoing this awakening to being an empath, and I found that it was very difficult to write about myself. I didn't want to relive the emotions. I didn't want to relive all the details of it. And yet I was told over and over again that this is something that I had to do, that it was something that would help me a great deal to have this tool of journaling. And one day I just switched it up and I started writing about somebody else's experience. I guess I projected myself as a 15-year-old girl because that's who Jenny came to be. And the more that I wrote about this other character having these problems, the more, not only did it come out of me, not only was it very cathartic, but I realized that I was learning and there was more education in it than just writing about my own experiences. I was actually finding solutions to the problems I was putting on paper.
So it was working. That exercise in journaling helped you.
Extremely.
And a book became the byproduct in some ways.
It did indeed.
And you say that perhaps a little bit of overlap between the character Jenny and you, Jeannette?
There is. Yes, you got that twist in the name, sure. There is a lot of overlap there. Most of everything that Jenny in the book experiences, I experienced myself in my life. So I just kind of built other characters around that.
You never were a journal keeper or a diary keeper when you were younger?
Not at all. I did, however, have a newspaper when I was a kid. I published my own newspaper called Jeannette's Gazette. I was 10 years old, 10, 11, 12 years old. For 3 years, it ran in my neighborhood, sold for 5 cents a copy.
Nice.
Yeah.
Sold ads too?
No ads. Oh, although that would have been a good idea.
No worries. We're just trying to explore a little bit about this idea that some people are much more in tune to the people around them, and some might describe them as people persons. That you're a people person if you tend to be more empathetic. Is that fair to say, or is it creating more challenges than it's perhaps solving? It
creates more challenges. What they're finding is that most highly sensitive people are also highly creative people. For example, Alanis Morissette, great Canadian, she identifies with being highly sensitive and starred in the movie that Dr. Elaine Aron, the person who coined the empath phrase and highly sensitive person, she wrote a movie called The Sensitive, and it was produced based on all of her findings, and Alanis Morissette starred in that. The way that Alanis describes herself as a child is the way any highly sensitive person is going to recall their childhood. That is, while they might have wanted to be a people person, they found most of the times that they did not have a lot of close friends, that they retreated and might have been considered an introvert, and had a lot of imagination, a lot of imaginary friends, a lot of imaginary places they would go. They lived a lot in their head as opposed to in the outside world.
We're talking to the author of Diary of a Teenage Empath, and described in one news release, it's to paranormal what Twilight was to vampires. Is this about paranormal? Is what you described as sensitivity, do you feel it's something beyond the consciousness?
That's a very good question, and one that I'm still trying to find an answer to. I know for me, I don't feel like I'm 100% connected with my fellow man. When I'm in that empath place, I feel that there is something definitely higher or deeper going on. But I'm a human being, and I want to live here in the human world, and I want to be connected to my fellow man, and I don't want to be afraid to do it. I especially don't want to look and see the young people afraid to do that or having difficulties with it. So to answer that question, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. In the book, I touch upon a lot of paranormal just to keep it interesting. There's ghosts and there's telepathy and all kinds of things. But as an empath, as a highly sensitive person, I think that we're going to find as the years go on and the studies continue that science will have these answers. And we're going to get closer to the supernatural. It's going to become more ordinary. The supernatural will become more natural one day.
We're going to keep this conversation going. There's a guest that we've had on this program who says she talks to angels. And what I'm sensing from her is she's an empath, perhaps. But we will open the door to that conversation. Keep things going here in just a few seconds as we continue the conversation with the author of Diary of a Teenage Empath, The Awakening, Jeannette Folan. We'll be right back after this. Just before the break, we're talking about a woman who says that she talks to angels, but in some ways you hear people who are described as psychics or who have some kind of an ability. They just seem to be very in tune to others. Is that something that's been explored at all?
That's an excellent way to describe it, being in tune to others. The way that the highly sensitive brain works is that it is called sensory processing sensitivity. What we do is we take the tangible external stimuli around us and we process it deeper at a deeper cognitive level. And in other words, the highly sensitive person, they process that sensory data. Not only are we more in tune with the little nuances of how you look, how you sound, your posture, we seem to be very good at reading people, but then that information is also processed deeper, dissected even more.
And that's going to influence how you react to people. Clearly.
Yes, and it happens very naturally. It's not something even that we're aware of, I don't think, until we become aware that this is what's happening to us.
Until it happens. And you say the difference between being highly sensitive and being an empath, there is a difference?
There is a difference. A highly sensitive person, they account for 20% of the population. It's fewer percent of the population that are empaths, and that is the difference between a highly sensitive person. It's that external, tangible sensory data, whereas an empath, it's intangible. So that's when the person walks into a coffee shop, the people across the way are upset that their dog just died and they're crying. An empath doesn't have to hear, see, or know the people to suddenly feel a rush of sadness.
Mm-hmm. Here with us again in our studio this afternoon, the author of Diary of a Teenage Empath, The Awakening, Jeannette Folan, is here in our studio. Almost sounds as though there may be, some will say, are we talking about autism spectrum disorder in some ways? Because, if you have, I don't know if you've spoken with parents of children with autism, but they say in some cases very empathetic, very much in tune to the others around them.
Very
in some
empathetic.
Ways. Yeah.
Very. I have not explored that at all. My focus has primarily been on teens and teens who are going through the regular social anxieties, or I shouldn't say regular, because so many of them now are in therapy and having to deal with pharmaceuticals and mental health issues. So my focus was more on them.
And you've had some, perhaps you've opened some doors to parents who say, you know what, this sounds like someone I know.
I have. In fact, more adults have read my book than teenagers. I have to figure out how to change that. But in the meantime, the adults who have read it have said, one in particular said, I identified so much with my son being an empath, a highly sensitive person, that I think it's going to change the way I parent him. Instead of trying to compare him to the other boy, instead of trying to tell him to toughen up and get a thicker skin, well, now, in fact, she can nurture the skills and teach her child how to not only cope with the difficulties and the challenges of being an empath, but in fact to turn that around and to make it instead benefit, something that they can use, a tool to excel in life.
You had mentioned there was a passage that you felt was, kind of indicated or gave a good sense of what it was that was, that people are kind of hanging on to.
Yeah, I do. Just the opening paragraph of the book, when Jenny writes in her diary, the symptoms I experienced all pointed to some kind of mental illness. At first, my parents suspected that my behavior was due to a teenage crush or hormonal imbalance. They would give me half a hug and then shoot each other a look that conveyed more mockery than concern. But then they discovered the row of deep paper cuts on my arm. And 4 hours later, I was sitting in Dr. Foster's office. Most of Dr. Foster's questions were related to thoughts of suicide and self-harm. I told him I didn't have any of those thoughts or feelings. He asked what I was thinking when I gave myself the cuts. I considered lying, telling him some girls at school dared me to do it, or that it was the new fad instead of tattoos and piercings. But I never liked how a lie felt. It was too much like wearing someone else's clothes that were 3 sizes too small. So without weighing the consequences of the truth, I said, just wanted to make sure I was still here.
That says so much about you in some ways. You're the one who wrote this. And were these feelings that you had? Is this, or are you taking some artistic license here?
The artistic license there was, in fact, just borrowed from my niece, who 4 years ago started cutting herself and couldn't explain why, what she was feeling, couldn't identify the anxiety. And at the time, we didn't think any particular incident happened. She didn't recall any traumatic events, so it didn't seem like PTSD, but she was cutting herself.
Are boys or girls more susceptible or less likely to be empaths? Is there a way to say there is a gender divide in any way with this?
In the movie The Sensitive, Dr. Elaine Aron has identified that it is 50-50 for highly sensitive people. I don't know if that's true for empaths. On my website, empathdiary.com, I have a survey that I'm hoping teens will start to take, and that'll perhaps give us a little bit better indication.
When you brought some props in, and I'm not quite sure how they play into the conversation, but it was about how to describe what an empath is, or someone who's more highly sensitive to others?
Right. I have in front of me a very fine sifter that you would use for baking. It's got the fine mesh and there's the handle. And then in the other hand, I have a spaghetti colander, a strainer. And if you look at the sifter, the fine mesh, that's the amount of information that goes through the normal person, the non-highly sensitive person. And if you look at the colander, the great big holes, that's the amount of sensory information that goes through to a highly sensitive person, and even bigger holes for somebody who's an empath.
What does this say to us? What is it that you're hoping that lesson teaches us?
Simply that if you see somebody who is highly sensitive, who cries at the drop of a hat, who has a hard time managing their emotions, stop and think about that analogy for a moment and say, hey, what rush of sensory information, emotions, and environmental issues have gone through their filter, and that they're overwhelmed.
The other part of this release is a soundtrack, which I was saying, I don't recall a book being released, this type of book being released with a soundtrack in the past. Why was music important? Why is music important?
Music has meant so much to me from the day I was born. My mother's a music teacher. She taught me how to play piano, and now I've added a few other instruments to that repertoire. I've composed music, and as I found out through other fellow musicians, most of them are highly sensitive. Most of them are highly sensitive or empaths, and what teens don't love music. So I was trying to find another way to connect with the kids. I sat down and went through a music licensing site that allows you to pay for and use the music of independent artists. So I found myself 15 amazing independent artists all around the world. And then I wrote one of the songs myself. And you can download that for free on the website.
These are all located on the website, and you told us what that was. I had it here a second ago.
Empathdiary.com.
Empathdiary.com. Moreover, as you say, you're trying to direct people, some young people to your site to fill out the survey. What are you hoping to learn from that?
The survey asks a couple questions, one of which is, what type of personality are you? So I first direct them to 16personalities.com, and that's like the Myers-Briggs type of, and then they take the empath quiz to find out what level of empath they are, and then I just gather no names or anything, but I just gather an age and then their gender.
Is this something that's recognized widely by the mental health, the medical community?
Not yet.
Not yet. It's a fascinating discussion. We have a few seconds left here, and you did have a checklist that you've said has also shown to be quite effective at perhaps pointing people down the path that maybe this is something that someone they know, someone they love, someone close to them may be. I won't say afflicted by, but affected by. Affected by,
very good word. Yes, in the book, Jenny ends up, upon the advice of her very wise Aunt Maggie, she ends up developing a self-love routine. And Aunt Maggie expresses to her that she said, when you wrote me and I was on the El Camino, you sometimes didn't know how you got out of bed. And she tells her that the reason why her purpose has to be you. It can't be me. It can't be your boyfriend. It can't be your friends. The purpose of your life has to be you. You have to get out of bed in the morning to want to be with you. And so she helps Jenny develop a self-love routine, which includes a gratitude meditation, grounding, kind gesture, connecting with nature, reflective contemplation, celebrating myself and life, music, and learning from the masters. There are just a number of things that kids can develop that becomes a part of their habit, a part of their healthy habit of every day.
It, again, is fascinating, and I'm certain I know people that would be perhaps in the same area that you're talking about when it comes to being described as an empath. And it's a fascinating read. And just to let people know, the book is available where right now?
It is available through online Amazon, iTunes, Barnes & Noble, Chapters, and Book Track, which is where you can hear the soundtrack playing in sync with the book.
Well, again, congratulations on the book. I'm pleased to have you in the studio, and I'm wondering, this young adult and young adult literature, is this something that you're hoping to continue with?
What I'm hoping to continue is, and what I'm doing right now, is working on a workbook to go into the schools and start after-school programs. After, like chess or a French club or horticulture club, we want to start a club for sensitives. So those 300 kids over there at the Halifax West High School can form a club, and with a workbook that myself and a partner of mine are working on, they can teach themselves about their energy and about their health and happiness.
Fabulous. Again, thanks a lot for coming in, and appreciate having a few moments of your day.
Thank you.
We have been speaking with the author of Diary of a Teenage Empath, The Awakening. Jeannette Folan has been in our studio. And again, if you're looking for more information, you can visit the website. What's the website again?
Empathdiary.com.
Empathdiary.com.